Did you know that more than a few developers took advantage of a loophole in Blender? Because under the GPL license, anyone can fork Blender and make a modified version of the software. But a few companies thought they were smart and started selling Blender as if they made a new 3D software. So today we're gonna take a look at these scams and how each one of them was dealt with. I want to start with 3D Magics. It was actually one of the strangest cases of someone trying to turn Blender into a completely different commercial 3D package. When I was doing research for this video, I was stunned at their audacity. So around 2009, a website appeared selling a 3D software called 3D Magics for about $47. Presented it as an easy professional animation program, which is supposedly worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars, but in reality, users and Blender community members quickly noticed the software was essentially Blender with its identity stripped or disguised, and bundled with training material and marketed under a new name. The person publicly associated with the operation used the name Cody London. Although the real company structure, behind 3D Magics, was never really transparent. The domain ownership, for example, was hidden through Hui's privacy, and Tanner Rosendale later said that 3D Magics and another almost identical product, called Illusion Mage, were probably operated by the same person or organization. The business model itself was clever in one respect, which is selling Blender is actually permitted by the GPL license. The problem was how it was actually presented. You see, 3D Magics allegedly removed or it has hidden Blender attribution, and implied that another seller had created the software, and even used Blender Foundation imagery, like big bug punny material and different artwork from unrelated artists, to advertise the product without proper permission. And that is basically how it was caught. Blender users recognized the interface, also owned Blender Not a Number videos and some artwork appearing on the 3D Magic site. Then Blender Nation published a deliberately search engine friendly article titled 3D Magics Rebranding and Selling the Free Software Blender, so that anyone googling the product would discover what they were really buying. The community also contacted artists whose work had been used, also hosting and payment providers, and even Magix AG, whose trademark was uncomfortably close to 3D Magic's name. Surprisingly enough, the site briefly went offline in June 2009, then came back, dropped its price around $27, and eventually changed its wording to acknowledge that the package contained Blender and training material. The operation resurfaced along similar products over the following couple of years, prompting Todd Rosendale and the Blender Foundation to publicly warn users again. Eventually 3D Magics simply faded away rather than becoming a real independent 3D software. Generally speaking, there is no meaningful development history because there was effectively no separate 3D Magics software to develop, and today the own 3D Magics domain is no longer an active software business and had been reported as parked. So its legacy is mostly a cheap classic attempt of misleading customers into believing you created a 3D software yourself. Illusion Mage was essentially the second major version of the same idea behind 3D Magics. It appeared around 2010 and 2011 as a supposedly separate 3D commercial animation software, which was marketed with big promises. Things like quickly created professional or even Pixar-like graphics. But underneath that branding, users found a modified copy of Blender 2.49, with the Blender name changed in the title bar, in addition to menus and slash screen. Even the documentation was largely recycled, and some Blender users examined the package and found an old Blender Quick Start guide and James Carnister's Blender manual with the new Illusion Mage cover pages slapped on top, while much of the internal text still actually referred to Blender. But surprisingly, Illusion Mage technically acknowledged the connection in some parts of its site, saying that the main program was based on Blender, and it was released under the GNU GPL license. But the Blender Foundation argued that the marketing deliberately made that fact difficult for ordinary buyers to understand. You see, selling Blender itself wasn't the issue, because as you may know, the GPL license allows commercial redistribution. The controversy was in the way Illusion Mage made a freely downloadable program look like a newly developed proprietary product. The connection to 3D Magics was especially suspicious, because both sites used extremely similar sales pages, pricing strategies, affiliate marketing, and promotional techniques, and community investigators found similarities in their hosting and domain arrangements. The exact person or company behind them was never conclusively established publicly, and Blender community members suspected that the names used on the sites were actually aliases. Even supposed customer and testimonial identities were actually challenged using reverse image searches because they never found them. Illusion Mage also attracted accusations of using artwork that had nothing to do with the product, including work created in 3ds Max, Photoshop, and different other 3D software to demonstrate what buyers supposedly could achieve. And one prominent robot image on its site was traced by community members back to ESET's branding. And by February of 2011, Taro Zindel and the Blender Foundation publicly named 3D Magics and Illusion Mage together, while Blender Nation organized a community effort to push warning pages above their sales sites in Google searches. At the end, there wasn't any lawsuit or some official shutdown, because Illusion Mage and 3D Magics disappeared as a commercial product, and the Blender Foundation even said that it is not worth it financially to pursue them legally. Now let's take a look at Luxuriosity 3D Studio, which was basically an early ancestor of the 3D Magics and Illusion Mage scam. In this case, the Blender community was already dealing with it back in 2005. The company called itself Luxuriosity and sold a whole catalog of supposedly commercial software through its own website and eBay. So Blender became 3D Studio Professional, OpenOffice became Office Professional, while GIMP, QCAD, Audacity, and other free and open source programs were given similar generic commercial-looking identities. Funny enough, Taro Zindel publicly called attention to this company too, back in March of 2005, after some Blender users started reporting it. Luxuriosity apparently supplied source code rights and GPL-related information somewhere in its material, but the Blender's Foundation complaint was that its marketing deliberately hid what customers were actually buying. There was little prominent credit to Blender, no obvious link back to the original project, and the product was presented more like Luxuriosity's own commercial 3D software than a redistribution of a free software. The disguise also wasn't particularly sophisticated. I mean, this is how the community figured it out in the first place, because users at the time noticed familiar interfaces, file names and references from the original open source programs, with some Luxuriosity products which you could apparently still find in the original software names, but buried inside screenshots or documentation. As you can expect, Blender users started spreading warnings, and by the end of 2005, the case had become something of an inside joke. I mean, people on Blender artists were already referring to the company whenever a person tried reselling rebadged Blender CDs on eBay. The company eventually disappeared rather quietly, and a few years later, its website and product links were already dead, with no sign that 3D Studio Professional had evolved into actual independent 3D software, because it was basically a scam. "3D More Fun" was a more complicated case than 3D Magics or Illusion Mage. The controversy erupted in 2012, after members of the Chinese Blender community investigated a Chinese project called 3D More Fun and reported it to the Blender Foundation. And according to Taro Zindel's Blender Foundation post at the time, the people behind 3D More Fun had taken Blender, removed Blender-related credits and branding, presented their resulting package as their own locally developed 3D software, and they were apparently using that story as part of an effort to obtain Chinese government funding for software development in an education program. And unlike 3D Magics though, the main accusation wasn't simply that naive users were being charged money for free Blender downloads. From the community discussions I found that date back to that time specifically, they noted that 3D More Fun was not operating exactly like the direct sale 3D Magics business, which is part of what made the legal argument much murkier. 3D More Fun itself wasn't necessarily in a license violation. In fact, its defenders pointed out that removing the Blender logo could actually be appropriate because Blender's trademark and logo are separate from the GPL. And the 3D More Fun site eventually acknowledged that its program was based on the Blender source code. But the real controversy was everything surrounding the fork. The Blender community alleged that 3D More Fun initially presented Blender development as its own work, reused promotional renders and artwork from Blender artists without permission or attribution, and only became more explicit about its Blender origins only after people started investigating the program. Despite all of that, so the general sentiment around it was that this is another Blender ripoff, and the Chinese Blender community exposed the relationship. Then Blender.org publicly documented the case, and the awareness spread quickly enough that searches for 3D Mo Fun began returning warnings about Blender rather than just the project's own material. Eventually 3D Mo Fun never developed into an important independent 3D software, and essentially disappeared. On the other hand, 3iXM is the latest and the most modern case of this Blender forking controversy. It appeared publicly around 2023, and the interesting thing is that they actually marketed it as a sleek new 3D program aimed at designers, which misleaded a lot of people. And the thing that threw lots of people off from suspecting it at first was the heavily designed interface and promotional language presented it as its own next generation product. As you can see, you cannot really tell from first glance. But once Blender users looked at it more closely, they quickly noticed that the underlying behavior, tools and structure looked unmistakably like Blender underneath, just with a custom UI layer. A Blender artist thread from August 2023 became the main public discussion, with users pointing out that the software seemed to be using Blender code while, at least at the time, not clearly advertising itself as a Blender fork or providing an obvious corresponding source code release. And the thing is, the people behind it were also unusually hard to pin down. Community members traced an operation to a Dubai-based company, with Max Marca mentioned as a founder in public profiles, while the program's promotional material was also connected to Max Fabrique, who described himself as handling software and design work around the project. You see, the lack of transparency combined with disabled comments on some promotional channels and a website that gave little technical detail about the development team is a big part of why people started treating this software with suspicion rather than simply another Blender fork. And simply hiding Blender behind the new UI does not make the underlying code proprietary. At the same time, the community sometimes went further than the evidence justified. For example, one early forum commenter speculated the downloaded code could be malware, but I couldn't find credible evidence establishing that 3iXM was actually malware, so this should be taken with a grain of salt. And what made the software especially mysterious compared to 3D Magix and the others I just mentioned is that it wasn't merely a lazy rename. There appears to have been some substantial UI and workflow work layered over Blender, enough that some even critics acknowledged that the interface had been significantly reworked, but it never seemed to have broken as a serious independent 3D software, even though I think they could have done some work, some real work, to make it look like their own software. But at the end they were discovered and went into oblivion. And there you have it, guys. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also, please subscribe to this channel to receive more videos like this. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.